Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to the first episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. First episode of 2024. Yay!
Yay! 2024.
It already feels like, I don't know about other folks, but as Emily knows, my 2023 wasn't great. And so I am so excited for 2024. How about you, Emily? What are your excitements for the new year?
I feel filled with potential. Happy to leave last year behind. It was a year full of a lot of learning for a lot of people I know. And so
Mhm.
I'm ready to put that all into a little bit of action.
Fantastic.
Mhm.
And how does those feelings about 2024 kind of meld with the first week of the session since the legislature is back at the State House now?
Yeah, we are on, today will be day 3. We kicked
Mhm.
off on Wednesday for the first day of the session. Things already feel like in full motion. It's kind of wild.
Yes. I was going to ask
Both,
you about that.
yes, like both personally, I feel like, at some point yesterday, I was like, oh, wow, everyone's like exactly being themselves already. Like we've completely settled into our old patterns, like a dysfunctional family. And also, it seems like very clear what the priorities are going to be, what the disagreements are going to be, where sort of areas of struggle might emerge. And it feels like we're going to, be able to get a lot done because the priorities do feel very, very clear.
Hmm. Hmm. I was impressed that as of day 2, the House had already overridden one of Governor Scott's veto from last session, which you
Mm-hmm.
could do because this is the second half of a biennium. So it's instead of having to start from scratch, you could pick up where you left off from 2023. I don't know that I've ever known of a veto override that early in the session.
Well, it's funny, I'm a person who, when I like go out of town for, a couple of days, whether it's to come up here, go away for the weekend to visit a friend, I like tend to really like to clean my whole house before I leave, and like make sure the like sink is empty and the garbage is taken out, even if I'm like just going away for a day or two. And I don't know why, but that's just, that's the kind of
It's nice to come
attempted
back
tidy
to.
person I am. Yes, and it's a very interesting thing because, sometimes you can't do that because you're running late and you're rushing out the door and all those things. And the last week of a session in the middle of a biennium, like the last week of the first session in a biennium, you just get as much done as you possibly can. And then the calendar, which is essentially sort of like the things that are available for action, is just sitting there waiting for you when you get back. um, and so even though like they might be somewhat distant memories because it's been a few months since you thought about them, and so we walk into the building and the veto of the bottle bill is sitting on the calendar waiting for us to make a decision about it. And some bills that we sort of like had moved along and were ready, but then last minute compromises caused another bill to be the bill that moved instead, right? That's still just sitting on the calendar. So it's an interesting process. So yes, we overrode the governor's veto on the bottle bill. I don't know, have we talked about the bottle bill on the show before?
We have. We haven't done a full show devoted to it,
Okay.
but we have definitely mentioned it. I remember you mentioning some of the conversations you've had from trash haulers around
Yes.
recycling and the bottle bill.
Yeah. So we overrode the veto on the bottle bill, which essentially, expands the types of bottles that are eligible for redemption and sets up like a more functional system for the folks who collect the for the redeemers, like the redemption centers, to be able to do something with those bottles once they have them. And what is my sentence, Olga? Let me think. It's only been 2 days, but it's
Okay,
been
well, so
been
while
a
you
long week so
think,
far.
I will just remind folks,
Mhm.
because I forgot to tell people who might be tuning in for the first time, that Emily is one of 3 reps from the town of Brattleboro. She is currently sitting in Montpelier right now, and she is the chair of the Ways and Means Committee. And so we'll also be talking taxes in this episode because I have a couple of questions about your committee and something you said last week when the Speaker of the House was on the show.
Great. So bottle bill.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of passed a number of times. The governor's vetoed. We overrode the veto. It was an overwhelming vote. All Democrats and a couple of progressives and a couple of Republicans voted to override the veto, which is very, very unusual. And I think we've talked about this on the show before, but just like, it's a little bit of inside baseball, but usually a bill itself, the original vote on the bill, so second or third reading of a vote on a bill, can be very mixed, not partisan lines. Even partisan issues, there's usually like one or two people who vote on the other side for various reasons related to their districts or their life or whatever. But usually with a veto override, like strict partisan lines, it's about like the power of the chamber or the power of the party. It is not about the issue anymore. But a number of Republicans voted to override the veto, and it was really interesting to see where they were from and what they were from, because the money from the bottle bill, the extra money, goes towards the Clean Water Fund. And so there were a couple Republicans who have like real needs for the Clean Water Fund and making sure there's a strong Clean Water Fund in their districts who voted for it. And then there's also this really interesting thing in Vermont where Casella, this one company, controls a huge amount of the waste hauling, but not everywhere. And so the areas of the state that Casella controls or has a monopoly in had sort of solid Republican votes, but the areas, because they're major contributors to Republican campaigns, or maybe because they have good relationships with them because they do a good job. I don't know.
All the above, probably.
All the above. And then sort of like, in our Southern band, we don't tend to have that Casella monopoly. We tend to have smaller trash haulers. And so we saw a couple of Republicans in Bennington County also vote for the bottle bill, because our redemption centers down here have really asked for it, and the trash haulers down here have asked for it.
Well, congratulations having moved that forward so quickly. No, it still needs to go to the Senate, and they need to do their process. So we'll see where this actually goes. But yeah, I was impressed. You got in a veto override, day 2.
Lickety split, day 2. We also are going to likely pass overdose prevention centers out of the House on week 2. I think that is scheduled.
I didn't quite catch that. The what centers?
Overdose prevention centers.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, which we talked about with David Mickenberg and Daniel Quip a couple weeks ago. Yeah. And so that is likely going to happen on week 2. It's scheduled for a vote out of the Appropriations Committee. And that's another thing that was sort of like sitting on the calendar, essentially. Like it was voted out of the Human Services Committee, but the Appropriations Committee wasn't able to get it out in time last year.
Okay. Well, that I look forward to seeing where that bill goes and as it moves through the rest of the process. Now, remind folks, Emilie, is this the first session where, since COVID, that we're completely in person, or was last session?
Last session we were completely in person. I think we started the session masked, maybe.
Okay.
But I'm not even sure about that, actually. We were definitely fully in person last year, I think. We'll go.
Time. COVID blew time like out of the water. Yeah.
But I have like some vague memory of reading something from some Digger reporter that saying like, there's nothing actually magical and special about this session anymore. Like last session was the first one, back in person, and this, in some ways, the ARPA money has been allocated. We're not wearing masks. Second year of a biennium, so there's no new people, and so like in some ways this is like we're just doing people's business this year.
How exciting. Does that excite you? To just do the people's business?
Yeah, it is kind of exciting. Yeah.
I'm always curious, Emilie. We're going into an election year.
I've heard that.
Yes. And it's been floating around a little bit, especially those of us who live near New Hampshire have been hearing about it. Did What are your thoughts in this first week about the work you do and coming back to the work you do and why you keep coming back to it?
Well, it is 7 o'clock in the morning, and those are some big philosophical questions you're asking me. Let me see what I can do here.
This is what happens when you get me up at 5 and you give me coffee.
um, it feels like just, every day it feels just as important. And one thing was very aware of this last off session is that as I have more responsibilities in the legislature, over the course of the 5 years that I've been in, I have less time to be at community meetings.
Hmm.
And this last year, I was able to show up, and also it was just like the pandemic and everything was on, there are more community meetings now. So I was able to be, out and about a lot this summer and fall. And I just feel really aware that like all the reasons I ran for office are still exactly there.
Hmm.
And, I've made progress on all of them, but these are big issues. I still, people are still struggling to make it work in their lives, to just like make life work. And people feel really disconnected from the political process. And I'm still really holding this very idealistic vision that we can put, social infrastructure in place so that Vermont can work for all of us and not just the select few.
Mhm.
And that this isn't just going to be, this won't be a playground for tourists. It will be a place where people are living and thriving. And that this like hope and dream that we all realize when we're like bringing soup to our neighbors um, is something that we're doing to build rather than react. Um,
Mhm.
and that still really feels possible to me. And it still feels possible to me to talk about all of this super wonky political stuff in a way that actually makes sense for people's lives.
Mhm.
Um, but I do realize that like the more I do it, the more the language of it becomes real to me.
Mm.
Um, and so I'm really actually grateful for this show because talking to you every week and talking to our listeners every week um, really like settles me into my body and the reality of my community and how to talk like a normal person and unpack the stories so I'm not
Mhm.
caught up in them.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, because one of the things I think that is very amazing about this show is you and I keep showing up. And there's been some weeks when we're both tired and we don't want to, and we do. And I am grateful for that, because when I think of all the interesting people in Vermont and all the interesting conversations and all the interesting stories, I'm very grateful that we get to be a part of all that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
Me
I
too.
hope
Me
I
too.
hope we move the needle on things from time to time.
I do too. I also want to say, one of the funny things, this is my 6th year um, doing the show with you, being a legislator, all of those things. And as, I've been there long enough that I've gotten to see new people come into the political process and, whether that's legislators or staff or lobbyists. And that's also like very renewing to see people's like fresh hopes and fresh dreams and fresh energy to tackle these really tough stuff. Um, and one thing that's been really fun this year is, and a little bit last year, is some bills that I sponsored in my first couple years
Mhm.
um, that sparked conversations, but not necessarily action. I've seen like the understanding of them evolve. New people are sponsoring them who, in some cases, didn't even know that I sponsored those bills 6 years ago.
Huh.
And they're sort of like getting more conversation now because the narrative has shifted a little bit. And so
Mhm.
that feels really exciting too. Like I can actually, we've talked before about like how we're living in historic times and we can like sort of see and feel history happening in a way that I don't know is always true. Um, and I really feel that in the legislature as well.
Mm. Oh, wow, fascinating. Well, it's a good reminder of, just because things are moving slowly doesn't mean they're not changing. and the patience that is sometimes involved in changing policy.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about, I do want to talk about Scott's State of the State address in the
Can't
second
wait.
half, yeah, of
Yeah.
the show. I'm sure you can't.
Mm-hmm.
But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about your committee, Ways and Means, which deals with taxes. When we were talking to Jill Krowinski last week about some of the priorities for
Mm-hmm.
the legislative session, one thing you said about your committee is you wanted to work on tax justice.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to unpack that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
How do you define that? What would that look like in policy? Are there policies on the wall now or coming down the pike that you feel would be representative of tax justice?
Can we pause for 1 second? Because I have a thing I'd love to read about that.
Oh, sure.
I'll be right back.
Okay.
Sorry, video listeners.
We do record
Yeah,
this like it is live.
What?
We do record this like it's live, so you
We
get
do
things as they play
indeed.
out.
We do indeed. Yes. So, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about sort of what it means, what the, I talk about this all the time, what the point of taxes are.
Mhm.
But I found this sort of description of a value system around taxes actually from a different state
Hmm.
that I've been thinking about a lot. So can I just read it out loud?
Oh, sure.
Because
Please
this is
do.
what tax justice means to me, and then I can sort of talk about it. So progressivity. Tax policy should ensure Vermonters with more income and wealth contribute a larger share of their resources to support the common good than those with less. Adequacy. Tax and revenue policies must raise enough revenue to fund the public structures that create opportunity for all Vermonters, not just a select few. Equity. As in many other areas of public policy, tax policy has at times fostered inequitable outcomes based on race, ethnicity, gender, and LGBTQ status. New policies should remove these barriers and inequities and advance Vermonters' economic opportunity. And viability. Tax policy must have a viable path towards enactment in the legislature and be defendable.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. There is, so when we think about progressivity, for instance, but I think it's true in all these categories, there is how we actually structure the tax policy. So making sure, that the percentages of, if we use the income tax, for example, the percentage of income that is sort of set in the structure is, folks with more pay more and folks with less pay less because the folks with more are more able to and have more resources to give towards the common good. And so that's a piece of tax justice. But then there's also, have we structured it in such a way that those with more resources are more able to get out of those responsibilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a very practical example of this not related to tax policy is, historically the draft, wealthy families could buy their way out of the draft,
Mm-hmm.
buy their son's way out of the draft, right? And in
Right.
sort of earlier in America, that was like quite concrete. It was, you could actually just like pay a poor man to serve your time for you, right? In the
Yes.
draft. And then in more contemporary times, say Vietnam, you could buy your way into an activity that would allow you to avoid the draft, say college, right?
Right.
And similarly, that exists in tax policy, right? You can, pay for wealth advisors that help you through all of these loopholes that have built out, and lower income people can't pay for that, right? So that's a piece of tax justice. Is this, and then do people know to file? So we have this like amazing set of child tax credits or earned income tax credits in Vermont, which really, and the income adjustment on property taxes and the renter rebate. We have these policies that really are setting up our tax structure so that lower income people are getting a lot of money back at the end of the year or have less of a responsibility or liability for their taxes. But if folks don't know about that, and maybe they aren't even filing because they feel so left out of the system or marginalized by the system, then that's not working. And so tax justice isn't just like setting up the structures, it's also making sure the structures are working for all Vermonters, not just the select few. So that's one piece. And then in sort of like the racial inequality historical context, we are doing work to sort of modernize the system. So there's a lot of questions around how, a lot of research around how married filing jointly status benefits white wealthy families over middle class Black families. A lot of national research on that. So like, how do we set up our tax bracket so they don't benefit some racial groups over others? Or our appraisal system, we did reform on that last year to make sure that we were removing racial bias from how properties were appraised on our grand lists, and then how people had to pay property taxes based on that. So that's what I mean by tax justice. It's like that whole bundle of things.
Well, thank you for unpacking that, because I'm not sure that when people think of taxes, they think of justice in the same breath, and I don't think a lot of people realize how taxes flow. Like, we realize we love them or hate them, and we will say, oh yeah, they pay for our roads or they pay for our schools, but to actually see the mechanisms at work beyond just the, oh, I have to pay taxes, is a different process.
I mean, the greatest inequities and injustices in our country and in our world now and going far into the past is wealth inequality, right? And so much else comes out of that, right? Like slavery comes out, whatever, so much there. And taxes are the most effective policy tool to do something about that.
How exciting. Now, so what are some of the so for your
generous,
committee,
Olga.
What's that? No,
you're so generous with your excitement.
I'm a nerd when it comes to like, how do things work? How can I break it apart and then put it back together again? So what are some of the bills on before your committee that might be representative of some of these issues that you're working on?
Yeah, so some bills that aren't about sort of creating new revenue, that I would think of as sort of the tax justice work, is we have a bill right now that is looking to sort of standardize how tax sale procedures happen at the municipal level.
Right.
So we've seen that towns have the ability right now to start the tax sale process for very, very small debts to the town.
Interesting.
And so we've seen tax sales for like a few $100s.
Wow.
Of tax, yeah. In some towns, and some towns do it much more than others. And then the procedures, there are folks who we find out have really large municipal tax bills, but didn't realize that they were income sensitized, could be income sensitized on their property taxes, and might not even have any property tax liability if they actually just filled out some paperwork.
Okay. Ouch, that hurts.
Yeah. And so we just want to make sure that everyone has the same, fair shake at staying in their home and paying their bills, regardless of what town they live in Vermont. So that's one bill that's on our wall that we're taking up related to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In just the last 5 minutes before we head to break, how about your other committee members? When you talk about tax justice, are you all on the same page, or what kind of conversations come out of that?
I think I would say that that's important to everyone on the committee, regardless of party or region. Absolutely. I think that's why a lot of people want to be on Ways and Means. And it does mean something different to everyone, right? A fair share means something different to everyone. A fair shake means something different to everyone. Yeah. Folks in Chittenden County, I think, have a very different understanding of what, a grand home is or wealth is than folks in the rest of the state. They're really just like operating in a different bracket. You know, those of us who live on the, you know, in the Connecticut River Valley on the New Hampshire border, I think have a very different sense of sort of what competition means between states.
Mm-hmm.
But it is something that all of us are pretty actively invested in and working towards. And that's always feels really exciting. And what I try to do in even setting up the agenda for the committee is really balance conversations around these sort of like more technical modernizing the tax code bills, like the one I just described, really balancing those with the bills that are about raising revenue on behalf of sort of the needs of the other policy committees, because it allows us to keep on sort of coming back to our core beliefs around what a good tax structure is outside of some of the partisanship that can occur when we're talking about raising revenue.
Thank you. Well, I love what you said about how not everyone defines things the same way. Like the fair shake means something different for everyone, because I have a feeling when we go into our conversation about the state of the state address, that is going to be a theme.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
any last thoughts before we hear from some of our underwriters?
No, I'm so excited to hear from those underwriters, Olga.
Oh, I'm so glad you are. We're very grateful to our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're listening on the radio, don't touch that dial. And if you're listening on some other device, don't hit the space bar. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just tuning in, I am Olga Peters, the host and producer of the Happy Hour, and I'm speaking with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, who's one of 3 reps from the town of Brattleboro, and we've been very excited about the first episode of 2024 here that we are recording. And I want to thank, while we're at it, Brattleboro Community Television, who takes the video version of our show and shares it with media centers around Vermont and New England. So we thank you for the work they do there. And Emilie, what do we remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, and not the station, platform, nor employer friend.
Why, thank you. So I'm sure you were sitting in the House yesterday when the governor gave his State of the State address. I watched it from my comfy chair at home with my coffee and my warm blanket, which I have to say is the best way to listen to a State of the State address.
I would like some popcorn, actually. That would be, for me, the best way to listen to the State of the State.
Yes, there were popcorn moments. I have to say, before we dig into some of the specifics of the governor's speech, I have to say, of all the ones I've listened to from Governor Scott, this one was the most interesting to me.
Oh my God, everyone else I've talked to said it was the absolute worst of any of them. And so I am so curious.
I didn't say best, I said interesting.
Okay, I can't wait. I can't wait for your deconstruction.
So what surprised me is I was expecting some of the same old, and we did. We heard about housing, and we heard about demographics, and we heard about the crisis.
Is this the 7th year we've heard about, 6th year we've heard about demographics?
How long has he been in office?
8th year we've heard about demographics. I actually don't know how long he's been in office.
Yeah. So yeah, we knew demographics was coming. Yeah. If you had taken bets on that it wasn't going to be there, then you lost big time. And then he did talk about rising crime, which I think this was the first time he talked about that, which I found interesting that he talked about it. And I did appreciate that he acknowledged that for some people, feelings of safety. And I think that's something we can never forget when we're talking about how we approach criminal justice. Because there's those two sides. We have to make sure that people who are going through the justice system are treated fairly. But I don't think we can forget about folks' sense of safety, who, someone who has been victimized. I thought he was much more overt in his little waggle of the finger at the legislature. He always waggles his finger, but this one to me was the most overt. Don't spend money. You spend too much money. We're going broke because of you. It sounded like at times.
Yeah, it was paternalistic and condescending.
Yes. Yeah, when he got to I'm a realist, I was like, my I had to laugh. So my stepfather, who I love dearly, would, when I call him a pessimist, because he would say, I'm a realist. And I'm like, yeah, as the old meme goes, a realist sees the glass of water fuller than it needs to be.
Well, and I think can I jump in, or do you want to
Yes,
finish
please,
here?
go for it.
The whole idea of him describing himself as a realist and then spending the last 2/3 of the speech talking about these like random bucolic scenes throughout the state of Vermont that were like, all are very nice. I am not saying like everything he described was very nice. He talked about the Christmas lights in people's yards and the white picket fences and these like 5 random specific businesses that happen to be thriving in various areas of the state, and a bunch of people who've engaged in some very great volunteerism, because Vermont is amazing at volunteerism. And then he basically concluded that like, but had no way that we were going to move from this like dark picture of all the things that were the legislature's fault to this
Yes,
bucolic vision of the
and it was
Vermont
the
that
legislature's fault in this narrative. Let's be clear
yes,
about that.
in his narrative, all the bad in the first third was the legislature's fault. And then we, with no bridge, no conversational bridge whatsoever, other than this frame that he's a realist, we move into this absolutely Norman Rockwell vision of Vermont that we, should all celebrate. And there was no policy bridge of how we get and sustain this like absolutely lovely state that we live in that has all of these great qualities that we want to sustain. And like, how are you a realist if you think that like the legislature is destroying everything and we have all of these beautiful things that we need to like, that was like the most bonkers part of the whole thing to me.
Yes. Yeah, people should know, and any future guests who might be in there should know, if you say to Olga, I'm a realist, you're waving a red flag in front of a bull. I take that with such a grain of salt. Whew. And there was something else. And Dick DeGray, local Dick DeGray
yes.
made
yes,
an
yes.
appearance.
So
hello, Dick DeGray. The flowers are lovely. Yes, go ahead, honey.
I walked into the chamber yesterday for the meeting and I looked over and I was like, Dick DeGray is here, sitting in the well of the house. How did he get here? What is happening? But he was Dick DeGray is a local person in Brattleboro who for a very long time, he's been on our select board. He's very involved in municipal politics. And for a very long time, he has watered the flowers on Main Street, and he is retiring from his task of watering the flowers on Main Street.
He's done more than water. He's actually like bought the flowers and planted the flowers and
yes. And he does that in sort of collaboration with the Downtown Business Alliance, who sort of pays for the watering truck and the flowers and all that stuff, and hires assistants for him. And yeah, he was invited to the State of the State. And so, that was one of the delightful bucolic pieces of the Vermont that we all believe in, that the governor described in his State of the State address. The other thing, Olga, that I just had like a lovely loving you moment during the State of the State was that he referenced one of the State of the States that we read aloud this summer.
He did.
Yes.
I said weeks. I know that name.
Yes. So if folks, if anyone listened to the State of the State and was like, who is this governor after the big flood in the 20s that the governor was referencing yesterday, you can hear Olga and I reading that State of the State aloud sometime in August, maybe.
Yes, and I will link to it in the show notes on the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think along with Phil Hoff, Weeks was the one we
Yeah.
liked the best. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and I was chuckling through his whole address because oh, sorry, I just got distracted. I have a white birch outside my window and the sun is coming up on the other side of the house. And so it's just this beautiful light show I'm getting right now. I feel very blessed. I what I just couldn't stop laughing at is, and that was probably cruel of me to laugh at, but just how much of his state of the state, I think, like your committee members, used concepts and language that everyone would nod their heads at,
Mhm.
but no one would define the same way.
Yes.
Like, he keeps coming back to that crisis of affordability, and I think a lot of folks in Vermont would be like, "Yep, we've got affordability issues."
Mhm.
And yet his way forward, and maybe the way you would take forward, or the way the speaker would take forward, or the way the Senate would take forward, may not be defined or prioritized or moved forward in the same way. So how do you think, Emily, the legislature is defining the crisis of affordability? And,
Well,
I'll just say,
yeah.
I think Scott's very clear that the only way out of this crisis is to not spend money.
Mhm. So a really sort of clear example of the difference there is there's one option where we don't raise the fees um, at the Agency of Transportation, and folks don't need to pay $5 more a year. Sorry, $5 more every 2 years for their
Mhm.
registration for their car. And then we have potholes on our roads because we don't have enough money to pave the roads. That's like a real deal. Like, that's just like a perfect closed circle loop of our transportation fund.
Mhm.
And how much it costs when your car gets damaged by potholes.
Mhm. Oh, yes.
I can afford $5 a year at the DMV. I cannot afford a one-time expense around my tire being destroyed
Mhm.
or my alignment being messed up.
Mhm.
For me, that's affordability. Like, affordability is when the state is set up in such a way that I can live my life and I make enough money, and unexpected expenses are minimized because I have consistent health care, because I am able to take time off to care for my family without losing pay at my job.
Mhm.
And so that stability and safety that government can offer by socializing those costs, like the paving of roads,
Mhm.
instead of all of us driving four-wheelers everywhere, that for me is affordability. And there was a lot of places in the speech where he, and this is like absolutely one of his great skills as a politician for this state at this time, is he talked about the need to act on climate change and the need to act on our housing crisis. But he has no proposals to do that.
Right.
And none of those things are possible without resources.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
absolutely agree that we need to reform Act 250, 100%.
Mhm.
I think we can do a lot to change Act 250, like especially in our downtown and village centers.
Yeah.
100%. One of
Uh,
the main ways we need to revise Act 250 is actually make sure that the folks who work on the permitting at the Agency of Natural Resources like have enough staff to answer the phone when someone calls them about the permits.
yes. Yeah. So these permits will
And
actually move forward in a somewhat quick manner.
yeah, and if we removed all permitting, even at the federal level, we would still not have enough housing to solve our housing crisis in Vermont.
Mhm.
because there are other issues at play.
Yeah. When I was watching this speech, I I have a number of folks in my life who really like Governor Scott. And
Mhm.
I think they like him from what, as I understand, as they tell me, he makes them feel kind of comfortable and safe that someone's a reasonable person is helming the ship.
There are some people who call him Governor Dad
Yeah, I okay. Yeah, and I could see that
because
in the
that he's like
speech.
he masters that particular communication frame. Yes.
Yes. Yep, and I could see that in the speech yesterday. I'm curious about one part of the speech that I found intriguing, and but I'm wondering if I only found it intriguing because I grew up in Vermont. So when he was doing that last what one third, two thirds, where he was talking about the bucolic Vermont and helping people, even if you don't really like them, but that's what community means. And I did appreciate him talking about community because I do feel that is something, especially after COVID, we've lost a little bit of, not just in Vermont, like everywhere. We spent a little too much time on Zoom and in our yoga pants.
Hmm.
um, but like when he got to that part about helping your friends and your community and that type of thing, I was nodding along because as someone who grew up here, that was drilled into me. If you're driving home at night and you see someone stopped on the side of the road stuck, you help them. And if
Yeah.
you get out of the car and you realize you hate this person, it doesn't matter because that's what you do.
Hmm.
And I'm curious, as someone who didn't grow up in Vermont, did that resonate with you? Were you like, oh, that is such an old, tired story? That's not
No,
what
that's why I
community
live
really is.
here. That's why I
Okay.
live here. Like I think that's the thing that might motivate my public service the most. Like what I see is that we right now have an economy that's stretched so thin that a lot of people don't even have time to show up for their neighbors or to
Yeah.
make soup. And I absolutely like, I love that, like, even on like a commercial level, there are so few people doing each thing that even if I like disagree with politically with like the mechanic, which I actually don't, but let's say I disagree politically with my mechanic, um, I would like still go there and have conversations because like that's the mechanic. Like we can't isolate ourselves. There's
We
so
don't
few
have
of
enough
us.
people.
And so yes, that absolutely resonates for me. But what's interesting to me is like he then tags that onto this like, and we need to get rid of partisan division,
Mm-hmm.
which I agree with. And actually, the legislature internally is incredibly good at that. One of my
Mm-hmm.
like deepest collaborators is a Republican from, the Newport area, from
Mm-hmm.
Coventry, and like we have a really solid working relationship with each other. One of a committee member that I collaborate with all the time on education policy is a Republican from St. Johnsbury, and I don't think like anyone in the state of Vermont will be like, oh, Emilie, she's always like walking the line. She's like not a real lefty. But the governor absolutely does not do that. He is like, his administration is right now like refusing to even come in and testify on like basic administrative matters, let alone like budgetary issues.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he like won't. So the fact that he says that is lovely. I think it's incredibly resonant for all of us. I think it's why I think it's why folks stay here. I think it's why folks move here. But what he actually offers in terms of substance regarding both how his administration behaves on his instructions
Mm-hmm.
and what we're going to need for the state to be able to continue doing that
Mm-hmm.
is just
What
there's a
I
huge disconnect. Even the example about like people delivering meals on wheels, like yes, I love that we have volunteers delivering meals on wheels, but his budget underfunds the people who like underfunds the actual meals for the meals on wheels. And if there's no meals for the meals on wheels, then no one can deliver them in his bucolic image of Vermont.
well, that was the part that I found annoying because I agree. I agreed again. It's that whole thing of we may be using the same words but defining them differently. So I totally agree with him that if we want community, we have to show up for it. and we need to engage and we need to participate. But as he was going through all of these examples of how we needed to engage and participate, I kept seeing the gaps like you did. It's like, well, I think what irked me is I felt at times like he was telling us to pick up where government wasn't going to be, because that would have cost too much money. And it
Yeah.
felt a little bit like making us take responsibility for the state budget, like us, Joe Public, Joe
Mhm.
Public. Um, we're not going to make sure that our elders don't live in poverty. So it's your job, neighbor, to go over and give them soup,
Yeah.
because, so many of our elders are living in poverty.
And I think one of the like further disconnects there is I think that image of Vermont is really resonant for folks because we all have so much pride in our sense of independence and our sense of codependence with each other. Um, and we've talked a lot, you and I, Olga, about folks don't want to sort of engage with government to get state benefits because of that frame of independence and codependence. But there is a difference between sort of government providing equally and equitably to everyone so that we have sort of the infrastructure to thrive or survive, and charity. And the system he's describing is one that's dependent on charity,
right,
which to me has much less dignity. And I don't think I'm the only person that feels that way. I'm also, there's like those heartwarming stories that go around on the social media about like some kid like had a lemonade stand or a bake sale, and like he had a lemonade stand example in his narrative, and like that lemonade stand like pays for like the school lunch debt of like their peers in elementary school. Have you ever seen one of those? And everyone's just like, oh, it's so sweet, the lemonade stand kid. And I'm like, oh my God, that's the most heartbreaking thing I've ever read. Like, why do those kids have school lunch debt in the first place? And so like in Vermont, like, the Democrats and progressives in the legislature like passed free school, passed universal school meals for kids. So like no one had to have a freaking lemonade stand to pay another kid's school lunch debt. And the governor would rather have the lemonade stands. And like, that's fine. He is welcome to that political take.
But it's shirking duty a little bit as a governor.
I'm increasingly frustrated with how much he obfuscates in his communications around that political reality of what he's actually proposing.
Yes. Well, I mean, he kept talking about demographics, crisis of affordability. We have never heard him talk about people need to earn more money. Like wages need to be better in this state. Nope, he's never said that.
And actually we've had a huge number of people move here in the last couple of years.
That actually was something that amazed me that didn't make it into the speech.
He
like not even a
like
that. Yeah, like I've been worried about demographics. He could have even made it sound like he was the hero there, and he totally sidestepped that part of the conversation.
And I think part of that is he's really like, in this last year or two, as he's getting sort of fiercer and more partisan, he's really leaning into his nativist tendencies. The last state of the state, he really made this big division between like Burlington and the rest of us.
Yep.
And in this one, I think sort of welcoming, celebrating new people moving to Vermont, I think maybe like for some of the more nativist base, that even for me, right? Like, I am a flatlander, and sometimes I'm like, oh my God, like Vermont Country Deli, like get out of my way.
So I plan my route around, when I know the Vermont Country Deli is going to be busy, it's like, how can I avoid that part of Western Avenue? And I will drive all over. Yes. But that's because I'm afraid of my life.
I mean, I go in there and I buy coffee and sandwiches sometimes. Like I'm not, it's just, I understand, I understand the impulse to like not be colonized here. We've talked about that so much.
Yeah.
I just, yeah.
I was really worried when he started talking about the bucolic Vermont that he would go to a very, as you said, nativist place. I think he did skirt that. I think he stayed away from that.
He always just skirts everything in all of these speeches.
You know, the thing that sometimes annoys me when I hear Scott talk about partisan politics is I feel our state house is very functional. And I think that is
Profoundly.
more than just because there's a supermajority. And I feel very lucky that we have Democrats, progressives, and Republicans all working on policy. Because I just always feel that the more people come to the table with different ideas, the better the policy will be at the end, even if it's got to be hashed out a bit. And it just bothers me that he doesn't acknowledge that how functional the legislature is and how lucky we are to have three parties.
It's interesting because, you know, he was a legislator, and it is something that legislators pride themselves on. And it's when I first came in, it was something that was really drilled into me as a very important value, is like the civility, the formality, and the like real congeniality sort of across parties, and how much we do, like in the committee room, we really do collaborate deeply across party lines. I also think that this sort of impulse in Vermont that like it's great that the legislature and the governor cancel each other out because no one will go too far is not helpful. I think that's counterproductive because I think it means we never actually get to like test out what's possible. And so if we cancel each other out, like we have problems we need to solve. And we're not ever like, it makes the chances of us solving those problems much harder. So I think in the committee process, it's like deeply collaborative decision making. I think on like the division of powers between the administration and the legislature, we're actually just canceling each other out, and it's not helpful.
But it doesn't have to be that way just because.
No, it doesn't have to be that way at all. If his cabinet would actually come to the table early in the legislative session to really work through issues.
Yeah.
And I will say the tax department does, but that is very unusual.
Good. Well, it's a shame because I have heard you say similar things for many years in a row, Emily.
It's actually getting worse every year.
Oh, joy. Well, that is a shame because the legislature doesn't have a lot of time to get things done in a session. And so we need all boats rowing in the same direction.
Me too.
Yeah. So we literally have like 2 minutes left. Anything you want to leave people with?
I just, you know, again, that piece of Vermont that's about people showing up and participating and having tough conversations and town meeting culture and all of that, like I'm still all in. If you're interested in any of this stuff, like come to a community meeting on a Saturday at the library, like reach out, call into the happy hour, like whatever it is. But like, you know, if we said something that you disagree with or agree with or just have questions about, like we're all here for the conversation.
Yep. The Montpelier happy hour at gmail.com comes right to us. So it's a great way to get a hold of us. Well, thank you, Emily. Good luck with the rest of the session. I want to take a quick moment and just acknowledge many folks down in the Brattleboro area are feeling the loss of Carlos, the bull, or the ox this week. So I just wanted to acknowledge the passing of Carlos after 19 years of being at the retreat farm. So rest in peace, big guy. And Emily, if folks need to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Folks can go to emiliekornheiser.org and you'll find links to all the ways to get in touch with me.
And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 and rebroadcast Wednesday mornings. You can also subscribe to us wherever you find your podcasts if you want the downloads as soon as I finish editing them. And hey, everybody, happy 2024. Happy 2024, Emily.
Happy 2024.